that when the scientist discovers a law such as the law of gravity, he or she just found that it was there and did not create gravity itself or decide upon its effect on objects accelerating at a constant 9.8 meters per second squared. The following quote from Bishop Barron sums these 2 points up nicely. If God has made the world, then the world is not God, and if the Creator is intelligent, then his world is stamped necessarily and universally by intelligibility. The intellectual culture that is shaped by the doctrine of creation provided the healthy breeding grounds for science. It is important to point out that modern science arose in European civilization in the 17th century, not in comparable cultures of the time such as China, India, or the Middle East. Christianity was the primary religion of Europe at this time. This allowed the theological and philosophical framework necessary to undergo the scientific revolution. I have often heard atheists use the argument of the Big Bang Theory as a way to refute Christianity. These people also were ignorant to the fact that the Big Bang Theory was developed by Catholic priest and physicist Georges Lemaitre. Many are unaware that the founder of modern genetics is Catholic priest Gregor Mendel. I think it would be beneficial to consider what the following people have in common. Tycho, Johannes Kepler, Isaac Newton, Blaise Pascal, René Descartes, Nicolaus Copernicus. They are all first practitioners of modern science and devoutly religious men. Maybe we should view Galileo's case as a tragic anomaly rather than a perfect representation of Christianity's relation to science. As previously stated, there have been missteps on both sides of the aisle. In our current culture, is there any effort from the sciences to reach out to religion to look for guidance on the basis of their experiments or the implementation of their scientific discovery? Maybe the United States Public Health Service and Centers for Disease Control and Prevention should have considered the opinion of genuinely religious people for the moral grounds of intentionally injecting African American men with syphilis. In the Tuskegee study from 1932 to 1972. If we understand that God created everything within the universe with intelligibility, we should approach the sciences and mathematics with confidence and panache. We should never be afraid of what we are learning about when we practice science, since everything within the universe and the universe itself was created by the one true God. I will finish this slide with one more quote from Bishop Barron. Truth is one, since all truth came from the one God, who is truth himself. Therefore, there can never be a conflict between the truths of science and the truths of faith. If there is a conflict between these truths, we are either dealing with bad science or bad religion. I would like to transition to a different topic with a quote from G.K. Chesterton. And it did for one wild moment cross my mind that perhaps those might not be the very best judges of the relation of religion to happiness, who, by their own accord, had neither one nor the other. The premise of academia at a university is to absorb and understand information taught by the professor. This model relies on the student assuming that his or her professor is knowledgeable in their respective field. In medical school, I trust that the physician teaching cardiology is staying up to date on the latest developments of the field. The moment I question if Dr. Samari really knows the first-line treatment for heart failure, that transfer of knowledge from educator to pupil is severed. Thus, in order to perform well on exams and become a good physician, I believe Dr. Samari when he says that ACE inhibitors are the first-line treatment for heart failure. However, we cannot confuse their knowledge of a narrow subject to apply to all aspects of understanding. Most agree that Andy Reid is a pretty dang good NFL head coach and creative play caller, but you would be crazy to ask him for legal advice or help with your taxes. When the professor discusses something such as religion outside of his or her field of expertise, we have to transition away from the mindset that everything the professor says is true. If your calculus teacher tries to give you advice on which player to draft for fantasy or how to fix an alternator, you will probably take her recommendation with a grain of salt. Thus, we should be very wary of religious advice from a professor who makes no effort to be religious and is generally grumpy. We have to remember and transition our mindset when they step out of their subject of discussion, while also being aware of the power difference between the professor and the student. The professor is typically older, has more education at the time of these instances, and the student has to rely on the teacher's knowledge and are judged off of the retention of this knowledge to receive the letter grade through exams. I actually had a teacher who tried to throw around his power by making statements like, "Talk to me when you get a degree," or "Hitler, the Pope, what's the difference?" These statements are a great example of this abuse of power. It is hard to stand up for myself at this time because I was young and didn't want to ruffle too many feathers. I knew it was wrong, but I didn't know how to articulate my frustrations at this time. Just remember the great words of G.K. Chesterton, and never listen to advice from someone about religion and happiness who possesses neither. In 2014, there was an article titled "Religion's Smart People Problem," written by University of Seattle's philosophy professor John Messerly. In this article, he states that 86% of academic, or as he calls them, quote, professional philosophers are atheists. I first find it interesting that he only considers professional philosophers to be those in the academic realm, as I would consider a Catholic priest to be a philosopher, all of which require a 4-year degree in philosophy, followed by 4 to 5 additional years in theological formation. But I do not think he includes these 35,000 plus men as professional philosophers, as it may throw off the 86% mark. Shockingly enough, Mr. Dr. Professor John Messerly includes himself as part of the, quote, smart people. Bishop Robert Barron, in his book Vibrant Paradoxes, eloquently lays out the path in which academic philosophy can become so lopsided towards atheism. If you want your entire department of philosophy at a given university to be atheist, it is pretty easy. You just make the chair of the department atheist. This professor will then hire a small group of professors who share similar views to him or herself. Quickly, the individuals who control the hiring, firing, and granting of tenure at the department are all atheists. When a new professor or graduate student is accepted or hired, his or her philosophical theses and writings will be reviewed by the accepting faculty. If they have theistic leanings, they will be less likely to be hired, as most of us would want our employees to share a similar view and vision of our given business, or in this case, philosophy department. These non-religious philosophy professors are now in charge of educating the next batch of students and are shaping them through thoroughly atheistic assumptions. As the students write their papers and hope to receive high grades, they will try to conform to the atheistic perspective, whether that is done intentionally or not. If there are any Christian students out of the class who hope to pursue an occupation in philosophy, they are unlikely to do so in a department at an academic secular university, which is hostile towards their views. This leads to even less theistic professors in philosophy at these major universities, and the further cultivation of atheism in our youth, as many associate religion they received growing up with being less intelligent, and atheism as being the more advanced understanding, as those who consider themselves the smart people are the woke philosophy professors who are primarily atheists. I know that feeling comfortable and not persecuted at work was important for me as I chose which residency to attend. I cannot imagine wanting to be the only Christian philosopher in a philosophy department made up of atheists. The last fallacy I will point out, in which the article, quote, "Religion's Smart People Problem" hints at, is as follows. People often mistake all forms of knowledge to be equivalent to the scientific form of knowledge. There is always new discoveries and knowledge to be gained about the physical world which was previously unknown to prior generations. In science, this leads to individuals who are of later generations having the ability to possess knowledge surpassing that of people from previous generations who we consider to be genius of their time. For example, most people know and take for granted that antibiotics are used to treat bacterial infections. This discovery was made in 1928 by Alexander Fleming when he found out that penicillin, which is a type of mold, stunted bacterial growth. This had huge implications for medicine and society, even raising the life expectancy 5 to 10 years in the United States. It is amazing that many kids in elementary school know that antibiotics treat bacterial infections, but that Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, and all other scientific minds prior to 1900s did not know this. This is how the gathering and obtaining of scientific knowledge is demonstrated. We should not confuse the accumulation of scientific knowledge with that of all knowledge. Many people assume that philosophers used to believe in God prior to formulating more convincing and conclusive arguments against the existence of God. And now that philosophy has advanced, we should all be atheists if we are to be intellectual. I would like to pose this question. Is philosophy more like science, or is it more like poetry, music, or art? A quick internet search will show that Luc Quénard is considered to be a great poet of our generation. Have you ever heard of him? Well, me neither. I would assume that most of you have heard of William Shakespeare or Dante Alighieri, and one would be rather insane to think that current poets have exceeded the brilliance of these men, just because they have followed Shakespeare and Dante chronologically. It would be wild to believe that a fourth grade elementary student could develop a poem exceeding the works of Edgar Allan Poe in depth or beauty. But we can see that a fourth grader can grasp the concept of gravity, but that Galileo could not. Let us not assume that insert your given philosophy professor here exceeds the brilliance of St. Thomas Aquinas or St. Augustine of Hippo, despite what he or she might think of him or herself. From the perspective of musical brilliance, Cardi B is not a superior musician to Beethoven just because she released her song Up in 2021 and he wrote his famous Ninth Symphony in 1824. The commonality between these two musicians does not lie in the quality of music produced, rather in that the former is tone deaf and morally dead, while the latter is just deaf and actually dead. Before finishing this topic, I will present another quote from the great G.K. Chesterton. You don't want to be so open-minded that your brains fall out. Here I would like to explore one of St. Thomas Aquinas' 5 proofs for God. I actually have a close friend with a devout faith who sees the contingency argument as essential to his belief in God and in his conversion to Christianity. There are many things that lead us to believe in God, and it is unlikely that the contingency argument for you specifically will be the one thing that ultimately convinces you that God exists, especially with me being the one to explain it to you. It nonetheless has its place in this audio presentation as it demonstrates the cerebral quality and depth that is accessible from the great theologians past and present as protectors of our faith. St. Thomas Aquinas around 1250 AD developed the following argument for God known as the contingency argument. In true 2021 fashion, I will use the summary definition from a random Quizlet search, which actually does an adequate job to explain the contingency argument in one sentence. Humans cannot exist without a necessary being who creates all, but is not created. This necessary being is God. I will likely not do the contingency argument justice in this audio presentation and encourage all listening to go find some better explanations of it on YouTube and maybe get lost in the YouTube rabbit hole, but here it goes. All that exists or can exist is broken up into 2 categories, contingent and necessary, aka not contingent. Contingent things are those which could conceivably not exist. The universe is contingent as we can easily imagine it not existing under different circumstances. Everything that we see in the world is contingent on other things to exist. For example, I am a contingent being as I needed my mother and father to exist in the first place and still require food, water, and shelter to continue my existence. Contingent things cannot originate from an infinite series of other contingent things, no matter how many years you add to the equation, without ultimately being derived from something that is necessary and not contingent. This necessary thing we call God. I feel this is a good place as any to ponder what or who God is. It is important to not think of God as the greatest being among all of existence. Rather, as St. Thomas Aquinas states, God is to be itself. This demonstrates that God exists outside of time and space. The analogy I felt explains this reality well is that God is the author, and we are the characters of a story. While the characters are confined within the story to a certain reality, time, and space, the author is able to reach down into this reality, operate, and change aspects of it. But the author also exists in his own life outside of the story in a different space and time as he drives to a coffee